Chapter 10. Masquerade. The trail was empty when Andross retreaded the path back to his ship. Nisjeta had offered to accompany him, but he politely refused. Now he walked alone, progressing at a leisurely pace through a jungle that was unnaturally quiet. Whatever had caused the ever-present din of life to become silent, he was sure it wasn't him. The curious part of his mind made him glance occasionally over his shoulder and at the trees above. He had little doubt that he was being shadowed to ensure his safe passage. The only tracks he had seen on the trail were his own. It was as though the Selkarth had never been there. It made recent events feel like a fever dream, the lingering pain in his palm dispelling this notion. Exiting the trail's mouth, he glimpsed the familiar pyramid shape of his flagship, the Incognito, which had served as more or less his home for the past years of his self-imposed exile. What started as a venture into optical stealth technology quickly morphed into an endeavor into creating the ultimate self-autonomous mobile command center, packed with enough firepower to tunnel into fleets and tear them from the inside, along with stealth and detection countermeasures to keep the vessel hidden while maintaining long-range communications with Allied forces. As long as he stuck to the relative safety of the ship's interior and cloak, he was as good as invisible, incognito. The strobing flash of lightning reflected off the matte black surface, briefly casting a gargantuan shadow that eclipsed the grassy field in front of him in deep darkness. The delay before the booming thunder was greater now, the rain and wind less stifling as the storm drifted away. He continued his stride to his ship while tapping a few keys on his wrist gauntlet, which served as a direct link to the Incognito's command console. The underside of the ship opened as the gravity lift engaged, with a rhythmic, looping hum. Stepping into the beam of light, he felt the sudden tug of the lift, pulling him into the ship's interior. He did his best to calm his nerves and ignore the flood of disorientation, as his inner ear told him that up was in two different directions. He snorted in irritation. Despite having used the grav lift numerous times, he never seemed to get used to the vertigo. The discomfort was short-lived as he made the 30-second journey into his ship. His levitation lingered above the hatch for the few moments it took for the aperture to close and seal, replacing the roar of wind and rain with the subtle hum of the ship's propulsion system. Andross felt his booted feet clank dully against the hatch as the gravity field deactivated. The vertigo was blissfully gone. He felt steady enough to walk on his own 2 feet. Despite it all, his headache persisted in the form of a rapid, sharp pecking above his right brow. Throughout the Selkarth ritual, he had resisted the urge to rub his temples or pop a painkiller. Now in his domain, he retrieved a pill from a pouch on his utility belt and swallowed it before his scalp began to sprout sweat droplets. Andross exhaled in relief as he felt the telltale wave of euphoria that wiped both head throb and dizziness, leaving him feeling more or less himself. Adjacent to the fading pain was his sight adjusting to the faint red glow of the ceiling lights of his ship's hangar. The space was vast, crowded with rows upon rows of the various ships and tank-treaded vehicles of the Venomian war machine, each of his own design. The underside of the prism-shaped flagship was divided up into 4 quadrants with their own respective grav lifts, allowing for rapid deployment of the hangar's armor battalions and fighter escort. If need be, the ship could stealth jump to a designated landing zone and deploy the housed army in just a few minutes, then jump away before the enemy could even begin a counterattack. A pair of boots clicked together to his left, and he turned to see the head of his ship's security at attention. Like him, he was Venomian, a tall hulk of a man in crimson-hued combat armor, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Behind him were a dozen or so Venomian soldiers huddled in an arrow formation, the saluting man at its point. The men flanking him smacked their rifles across their metal shoulder plates before mirroring their leader's salute. If he had a camera and took a casual snapshot of the scene before him. It would have looked like any other printed pre-war propaganda stapled to the walls and poles in the Venomian cityscape. All that was missing was himself superimposed behind the armed soldiers, with the big letters spelling out, "Lord Andross wants you," or something equally grandiose. He returned the soldier's salute.
"At ease, men."
He then turned his hand outward, showing his cut palm. The soldiers' eyes were obscured by their helmet visors, but there was a collective unease in the stiffening of their postures.
"Get that wrapped and treated now."
The lead soldier said over his shoulder to the man to his left. Andross blinked, and the soldier was at his side, wrapping his wound with a fresh bandage.
"With all due respect, my lord, you should have let us escort you. These Selkarth are too enthusiastic with their bloodletting."
Andross looked at the man, taking note of his nameplate and rank.
"Your concern is duly noted, Captain Tobin. But it was a worthwhile risk."
He nodded gratefully to the soldier as he finished wrapping his palm, topping it with a slap of tape.
"What's the status of the Great Fox and Shear's fleet?"
"Our scouts are still trailing them, sir. They're both cruising towards Corneria. Should we intercept?"
If they deviate, do so. Otherwise, leave them be. When the time comes, we'll remove Fox McCloud from the equation."
"Very well, sir. I'll pass it along."
Tobin replied.
"Very good, Captain. If there's nothing else, I'll retire for the night."
There was. He still hadn't stepped aside to let him pass.
"It's your nephew, sir, Andrew. He's been demanding an audience with you. I'm afraid I can't delay it any further."
Andross couldn't help but sigh in irritation. Not only was Nisjeta pressuring him to enact his plans prematurely, his nephew as well was threatening to become a liability. With his repeated attempts at communication, he could only hope that he had the common sense to cover his tracks.
Damn it all. Very well. But I'll table it for tomorrow and prepare the ship for launch, but keep us in orbit above Soria with the cloak re-engaged.
"As you command, Lord Andross."
He then gave the men around him a hand signal, and the surrounding soldiers dispersed, presumably to their previous posts and tasks. His head of security watched them go until they were well beyond earshot. Andross didn't give him the chance to be subtle.
Speak plainly, Captain.
"Sir, I would recommend a brief trip to the infirmary before you retire. You've gone well beyond your physical limit today."
Andross merely regarded his bandaged hand nonchalantly.
Are you really afraid of me having a mortal moment in front of my peers?
He held his hand perfectly level, as though balancing an imaginary ball atop it.
No headaches, tremors, or blurry vision. The medication is working perfectly.
Still, he persisted.
"It's to be taken sparingly, sir. Need I remind you? You've been walking only a couple months now, without servo leg braces. I can't jeopardize your health. I must insist."
For a brief moment, he thought about defying the suggestion, but decided against it.
All right, Captain. You win. I'll submit myself to whatever indignities the physician has in store for me.
Tobin thawed instantly.
"Thank you, sir. It really is for the best."
Andross turned and left the younger man before his irritation could register on his face. He trudged through the subdued lighting of the ship's corridors, passing the various members of his crew. They saluted as he passed, and he gifted them with the appropriate acknowledgement. Stepping into the stale air of the sick bay, he allowed the frantic clump of doctors to poke, prod, and pester him incessantly with their questions. An hour or so later, he was in the comfort of his own quarters. It wasn't until his haunches pressed into his mattress did it finally hit him. The combined fatigue and stress of the day draped over him like a weighted blanket. Or maybe it was the inevitable crash from the medication. Tobin was right. He had come close to his limit, and it was his own stubborn hubris driving him to the ledge and beyond. But something else was causing him to have these lapses in judgment, besides mere overconfidence. It was the weight of his newfound leadership and responsibility to his people and allies. Captain Tobin, as well as every soldier aboard his ship and under his command, had renounced their lives for the same banishment from their homes and families. To them, he was more than just a man, but a symbol of the enduring Venomian spirit. It frustrated him because it meant that they were only as strong as the one man that led them. No wonder his head of security was so concerned with his health. He would just have to put up with it for the time being. He couldn't risk the morale of his own men. Part of him hoped that enough of the Venomian spirit and command structure had persevered, that it would no longer require his oversight, and this farce of him being an indestructible leader who crawled out of his own deathbed. It was more fitting the punishment for his failure, he supposed, as he reclined his torso and rested his head on the pillow. If there was one thing his gunmetal send-off had taught him, it was that the body was fragile. It was not meant to die, only to be revived. There was no such thing as a factory reset for the living. After Fox had shot him in the head and left him for dead in the Venomian desert, he had crawled on his hands and knees aimlessly. He had no tangible recollection of his rescue, aside from brief flashes of consciousness, a feeling of his mangled body being hoisted up by several hands, then dragged away, then nothing. It was like being plunged into utter darkness, a state of not knowing. There was no mental calendar to track how long he had spent in this strange void. Then he had been revived, and the agony had started. He had read fables during his childhood of healing waters, elixirs, and so-called Lazarus pits that baptized the fallen in their warm, euphoric healing auras. His body's reanimation process had begun, with random clusters of nerves sparking to life, then fizzling out only to be relit and seared again and again, as though a sadistic hand was scorching sections of his skin with a lighter at random. After what seemed like an eternity, the burning sensation faded to nothing, leaving in its wake a dull ache and a feeling of utter exhaustion, as though in his unconscious state he had spent a week in a mad frenzy until his joints and muscles gave out. It was only until his vision and awareness came back to him that he dared to move his limbs. His rescuers had bandaged his forehead, partially covering his eyes, and when he removed it, he was surprised to see, aside from a few scrapes and bruises, his body was relatively intact and not a charred mess. He had awoken in the medical bay of the Incognito, his nephew at his side looking as haggard and exhausted as he felt. The ship's cloak had saved them all, making it child's play to slip between the cracks of the Cornerian fleet's formation. He gave one order, before he had been put back under.
Have all remaining forces stand down and surrender. Relay this as orders from Venomian High Command. Any deviation is to be disregarded. Beyond this ship, tell them all. I'm dead.
His crew were loyal. They carried out his orders to the letter. However, there were a few dissenters. Defeat had made them disillusioned. It was a small group of the remaining crew, a little over a dozen, insisting that word of his survival had to be relayed to the rest of the Venomian populace. When he was both physically and mentally able, Tobin had forwarded their demands to him, and Andross, being the pragmatist he was, acquiesced. He had assigned them to a shuttle as an envoy to spread word of his survival. He had no intention of killing them in front of the rest of the crew. Such a callous execution would cause mutiny to spread like a virus through the halls of his ship. Better to let them leave of their own free will, to have peace of mind, before he detonated their ship. No fuss. No mess. No big loss. It was almost custodial in nature. He laid on his side then, hand grazing the cool underside of the pillow, focusing on the soft purr of the ship's propulsion. Andross began one of his deep breathing exercises he had done many times to fall asleep. Each repetition, the ambience of the room grew fainter, the feeling of his body sinking into his mattress becoming tangible. His conscious mind was nearing the precipice of sleep when his half-slitted gaze drifted to his nightstand, to the data chip resting there. The round flat disk looked like discarded change, something that could easily be expelled to the corner dust of his room, never to be found. He felt the past hooking its claws into him, rousing him to full wakefulness.
It'll be that last thing I do before sleep,
he thought before sitting up, his hand inserting the data chip into his wrist unit. It made a muted chirp as it powered on, waiting for instructions.
Playback audio files, oldest to most recent.
Again, the watch chirped as it began to play. There was a faintest hint of static in the recording before a female voice began to speak.
This is healer Misha Vallon. Clearance Level 2 Praxa medical staff. Any one individual accessing this recording must acquire equal or elevated clearance status to access these recordings and other material regarding the case file. Codenamed Pod Sleeper.
She sounded serious and professional, a higher-up laying down stern safeguards to maintain confidentiality. Being a former practitioner himself, Andross couldn't help but respect it. He almost regretted the breach he had committed.
I am pleased to report the subject, as of 6 hours since recovery, is nearing stable condition. Despite the previous difficulties upon first contact, his hostile disposition has dissipated. It seems the cryo-terror affliction was the chief cause of the outburst. As for the recovery team, only minor injuries were sustained, mostly concussions and a few sprains. It's safe to say we got lucky when the pod sleeper became fatigued enough to be restrained. Otherwise, we would have probably been searching the surrounding forest for him. I keep thinking back to the common protocols and treatments for cryoterror, but nothing accounts for patients becoming this hostile. I'll have to petition for an amendment to the current MO. As reiterated, the patient's condition is stable. Whatever species it is, it's so far accepting the blood we're feeding it. It's a sheer miracle that the patient isn't experiencing any further complications with the...
Her voice trailed off as alarms began to sound frantically.
Oh God, he's having convulsions. Get a backup medical team here, now!
The recording suddenly became distorted, with hissing, popping static, the rapid fall of several booted footsteps, and a frantic metallic clanging sound.
Keep his IV in place. Crystal, loosen the restraints. He's going to break his arms otherwise. I'm trying. He's squirming too much.
Another female voice said, just as panicked. There was a sudden scuffling sound, a crash of glass, and the recording came to an abrupt halt. A brief intermission of low static passed before the next recording played. Again, it was the same female voice. However, when she spoke, her voice was a little fatigued but wary. It was clear that the recording was made shortly after the previous struggle in the operating room. The surrounding medical team were in the eye of the storm, ready for the aftershock of symptoms to come.
Patient status is post-critical. If this is the last of the seizures, he should have a chance of pulling through, provided his blood pressure doesn't plummet again, and there aren't any further complications with the blood transfer. I hope beyond hope we didn't just kill this patient. I'll wait until he's safely sedated and asleep before I conduct my physical examination. We already have the machines analyzing his blood and tissue samples. Maybe we'll get lucky again, and the cross-references will come back with something conclusive. Something tells me we're in for a long wait for answers.
Silence, then a crunch and hiss of static.
I've completed the preliminary analysis. The patient is still out cold, but so far no disturbances or irregular sleep patterns have been detected. It's safe to say the worst has passed. Blood and tissue analysis was a dead end. Whoever or whatever it is, he's a long way from home. It seems that the rule of 2 legs, 2 arms, and 2 eyes applies far beyond the Cyrenian realm, another point to the biologists. I'm almost tempted to award our guest a species designation for my notes, but I shouldn't overstep. The pod sleeper is a male carbon-based bipedal life form. Based on skin tone and scarcity of hair follicles at a glance, it seemed what we were dealing with was a reptile variant of sorts. This, however, has been thoroughly dashed when my colleague Crystal made note of the subject's sweat glands and teeth. Upon revision, I'm comfortable speculating that it's a land-dwelling omnivore of some kind, native to cool to warm climates. We've managed to attach a secondary IV to feed a slow trickle of nutrients. Either way, he's going to wake up with an appetite. We'll just have to segue his diet to solids tentatively. As for the telepathic barrier, I've conducted a routine brain scan and compared it with the one taken while he was conscious. I wasn't sure what to expect based on the lack of premonitions me and Crystal sensed. Both scans came back completely benign. Seems as though there's a normal ticking brain in there. But why can the machines detect it and not us?
There was a sound of papers being crinkled as they were rearranged and set aside.
It's just so different, but so familiar. And how in the realm did the pod blip into the atmosphere without tearing itself into pieces? Nothing for it, I suppose. We'll continue to monitor the patient. I'll question him after he's had enough rest. Finish the interrogation with the patient as of 5 hours ago. I anticipated some difficulties with communication, such as fatigue, hazy memory. If anything, this was more of a subtle cognitive test before a more thorough questioning. Distress and confusion was evident at the get-go. It seems the patient is experiencing amnesia. I immediately did a quick cursory examination, but I couldn't find any evidence of head trauma, more than likely the result of the seizures.
There was a sound of shuffling papers, but this felt less confident, unsure.
We aren't pressed for time here, and aside from the memory loss, there doesn't seem to be any residual nerve damage. There's no way to predict when his memory will return. It could be days, maybe even weeks. A couple of techs went over the interior of the pod and retrieved a blaster pistol and some unopened rations from the cargo hold. The navigation console was damaged, but we were able to access its databanks. They were empty, maybe even scrubbed deliberately. I don't know what to make of this. This whole thing is just a complete unknown. No helpful clues, barely any hints, and the one person who can give us answers can't remember a thing. It bothers me. It bothers the hell out of me.
Andross flicked his watch off as he pondered what he had just heard. The drowsy veil around his head evaporated, as an idea suddenly took root there. Call it fate or random chance, it seemed an interesting opportunity had landed right in his lap, and if taken, it would neutralize Alex and facilitate his capture. A clever grin spread across his face as he typed in a familiar code to an old associate on his wrist communicator. There was a series of hums and chirps as the line was funneled through his ship's encryption matrix before being bounced between the various frequency nodes throughout the Lilat system. The long chain ensured a convoluted trail that could be severed and rerouted at the faintest detection of an eavesdropper. A full minute passed before the call was received. There was no greeting from the other end. There never was. But he knew his contact was on standby waiting for instruction.
Hello, old friend. I've prepared a ruse of sorts, one that I'd imagine you'd quite like.
When the money comes, don't ask questions.
Wesley repeated the mantra in his head as he circled the Cornerian freighter. His reptilian hand gave an experimental scratch across the serial number painted along the nose of the vessel, testing the adhesive of the numbers and letters. Flipping his hand over, he saw that not a hint of his paint job had flaked off. It was indistinguishable from any other official paint job, and the adhesive lamination would ensure that it wouldn't burn off when the vessel entered planetary atmosphere like other cheapskate forgeries. He walked a full circle around the vessel, inspecting the painted hull with a critical eye, looking for even a hint of an error in his replication of the official military insignia. It was a perfect replica, down to the most minute detail. Everything was perfect except for one thing that he had been made to omit: the ship's transponder ID signature. For the 100th time that day, Wesley fought the urge to question his client for this bizarre and potentially disastrous request. He had done many forgeries and paint jobs on his space station, the Tapestry, for various political groups, crime families, and even a few of the extremist paramilitary factions, like the infamous Venom Strike. He knew he was in for something interesting when his broker relayed the request for the docking bay to be empty of other clients and for the surveillance system to be deactivated. He had balked at the terms, but soon caved at the sheer mountain of credits he was offered. The initial fee was nearly enough for a down payment on a second station module, and if the other half was just as generous, he would have a sizable nest egg for retirement. Then he had met his client, or more accurately clients, and the oddities had begun to pile up. They had arrived in an unmarked freighter that was for the most part undamaged, aside from some light blaster scarring, which in of itself wasn't surprising. As promised, he had agreed to power down the overhead cameras. Then he went to greet his customers. He wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a group of grizzled pirates looking to give the ship a makeover to pull a heist, or an exiled political figure with prospects of a ship capable of slipping past Cornerian port authorities. During the end of the Lilat War, he had taken full advantage of the mass exodus from Venom by positioning his station between Macbeth and Titania, right in the middle of the desperate rush of traffic. As a forger, he was in the business of the golden ticket, and boy was business good. But the group of men that walked down the boarding ramp didn't have that wide-eyed look of desperation or the cocky swagger of career criminals. They were very quiet and subdued, barely acknowledging his existence as they walked silently past him. He had made a furtive head count of 16 men. They exited the ship in pairs, each lugging along hefty crates that they arranged in a semicircle a ways from the vessel. The last man, who Wesley had nicknamed the Bagman, was a black-feathered avian with milky white eyes. He simply walked up to the forger, then placed a briefcase in front of his feet.
The first half of our agreed fee. Please feel free to count before you begin your service on our vessel.
He had said before he had walked off to join his crew. Sure enough, when Wesley had peeked inside the case, there was indeed a hefty sum of cred stacked in neat rows that made his greed salivate. Throughout his detailing of the ship, he had snuck glances at the mystery crew, subtly craning his neck to hear the random snippets of their hushed conversation. They were all dressed in clean and neat gray flight suits with heavy-duty gloves and boots. One of the larger ones, a Venomian, typed in a code into the keypad of one of the crates. There was a soft click, and the lid opened to reveal a neat row of gleaming gunmetal. He let out a mental whistle at the collection of firepower that was being casually passed around like party favors. They had repeating blasters, grenades, grenade launchers, even a few flechette guns. This kind of loadout was way too excessive for routine bag job or hijacking. Then there was the armor and uniforms they began to don and clip to their plain fatigues. He caught a good look at one of their arm patches and recognized the signature bloody-mouthed wolf insignia of the Cornerian Rangers. He couldn't help but feel a little impressed and a little worried. His comlink suddenly sputtered to life, not wanting to draw too much attention. Wesley sped walked to the front of the ship. He leaned against the fueling chassis, using its thrumming hum to mask his conversation.
Did the ship pass the smell test?
Sure thing, boss. Any casual scans will read the freighter as belonging to official Cornerian government dignitaries.
Zaechek, his chief technician, said. He looked over his shoulder and saw the other man at his station, which was inside a hanging glass booth that gave him a perfect bird's-eye view of the hangar. Even from this distance, he could read the uneasiness in his stiff posture.
That's it then. I guess we'll just settle in, patiently, until they give us the other half on the way out.
That it then. You sure letting them have the whole station to themselves was a good idea? I mean, it's just you down there.
It was caution he knew and respected. These men weren't just packing. They were armed with enough firepower to take on a small army. He pictured how it looked from Zaechek's point of view, up in the observation deck. Wesley probably looked like a poor sap who just fell into a predator enclosure during feeding time.
Something tells me our clients don't want any attention drawn to them until the real shooting starts.
I hear you, Wes. But I'm just saying, they could take over the station if they wanted to.
Leave it be, Zay. We'll mind our business. They'll be gone soon enough, and we'll be all the richer for it.
Wesley said, trying to quell both their worries by redirecting the subject back to cash.
I'll say, this will be our biggest profit yet. But what kind of job do you think these guys are trying to pull off? There's no point giving their ride a paint job without the ID transponder code. They're bound to get flagged.
None of our concern. And you make sure the rest of the crew keep to themselves about it. Just think of the pay.
And the 2 months of vacation on Aquas. Plenty of beaches and babes.
I'm sure that will keep the curiosity at bay.
Zaechek replied, finally persuaded by the prospects of a tropical getaway, and signing off with a click. He did a second once-over of the vessel, and after finding no mistakes in his paint job, he leaned against the landing strut of the ship, while pondering the strangeness of it all. Just what in the hell were these goons up to? It had to be something serious, judging by how heavily armed they were. Most crews were carrying. Who wasn't these days? But these men seemed to be equipped specifically for maximizing casualties. Terrorism, maybe. But he had their ilk in his hangar before, and none were this financed and orderly mannered. Most had that restless, fiery-eyed look of the fanatical, looking to express their manifesto through armed violence. By contrast, this particular group of armed men moved with the speed and precision of a military unit. When they communicated with each other, it was in clipped, hushed tones and curt hand signals. They looked every bit the elite soldiers they were masquerading as. It made the paranoid part of his brain wonder if this whole thing was some kind of elaborate sting operation. And these were genuine Cornerian Rangers here to crack down on his illicit practice. He flicked the thought away as he continued to spectate. It was another couple minutes until they had finalized their preparations, checking ammo counters on weapons, sheathing knives and sidearms into well-oiled holsters. The previous civilian-clothed men were now guised in the purple and gray plated armor of the Cornerian Ranger Regiment. In their midst, Wesley saw one of them break from the huddle and march to him purposefully. It was the white-eyed bagman, and when he stopped a foot away from him, he casually scrutinized the ship. Wesley was expecting something, maybe a side comment, a few questions, or haggling of the price of his services. But the avian merely shuffled his head feathers in what Wesley assumed was his race's equivalent of a shrug.
Yes, it will do. It will do.
Before the forger could reply, the other man made a curt gesture to his companions, who immediately began to march in an orderly fashion to the ship's boarding ramp. At the rear of their formation, 2 of the armored men broke off and made a beeline for him.
Oh, shit. Now I'm really in for it. They're gonna put me in cuffs and haul my ass away.
The despair was short-lived, as one of the men slid a second case to him, after halting in front of the bagman. It glided across the oil-grimed floor until it bounced off his shoe, emitting a metallic rattling sound. He opened it and felt his tongue slide across his lips appreciatively at the neat stacks of credits inside. Setting the case aside, he turned back to regard his client.
The paint job's finished. The serial number is up to date. It should fool any curious patrols or port authorities.
The other man remained stoic but nodded.
There's just the matter of the ID transponder.
Wesley heard himself blurt. The bagman's beaked visage turned mechanically towards him, like an artillery piece.
And what significance is that?
Wesley suddenly found it hard to meet the man's gaze, and it wasn't because of the dead fog color of his pupilless eyes. His stance, his expression had gained a subtle, threatening quality. The veneer of politeness had fallen away completely.
It's just that, without a proper ID signature, your ship is bound to be intercepted. And if you're planning to land on Corneria...
And you know exactly where it is we're going.
The forger's forked tongue flicked nervously as he scrambled for an answer. His eyes darted to the man's side, and he felt his throat tightened as he saw that the bagman's gun had materialized in his hand.
That's not it at all. I meant you'll be caught no matter where you land. But I swear, I don't know.
Right,
the bagman said, stretching the word out ominously.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be nosy.
No need to apologize.
He then lazily gestured with his gun at the empty hangar behind him.
No one to apologize to, because no one was here. You were given an anonymous donation, and you were none the wiser, right?
Wesley nodded vigorously before saying,
Yeah, I understand. I don't know, what happened, and no one was here.
The white-eyed man favored him with the smile that spread like a crack in ice.
I guess you're off the hook then. But don't worry, my newly wealthy friend. Where we're going, they're going to let us through the front door.
He said slyly, walking past the forger and up the boarding ramp. Wesley didn't know what he meant or how to reply. He simply watched as the freighter's engines powered on. It then made a smooth 180-degree turn before it exited the hangar, disappearing into the eternal night of space.